My name is Eleanor Miller. I'm 71 years old, and until a week ago, I thought I understood the shape of my life. I'd just buried my husband Frank, the man I loved, for 32 years. He died suddenly, and the grief was still a heavy fog when I sat down to dinner with my son and his wife. The dining room felt too large, too quiet without Frank's warm presence. His chair was empty, but I kept glancing toward it anyway, half expecting to hear his laugh or see his eyes crinkle in that familiar way. Across from me sat Trina, my daughter-in-law of 15 years, with her perfect posture and colder than usual eyes. My son Brian sat beside her, quiet and unreadable. "And then," Trina said it, not cruelly, not dramatically, just matter of fact. "Now that Frank is gone, Eleanor, it's time for you to start thinking about what's next. Maybe packing up." I blinked. I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. Brian didn't flinch. In fact, he nodded slowly, eyes on his plate. Trina continued, "The house is just too big for one person. It's not really practical anymore." The air around the table thickened. I looked at Brian, my boy. The one who used to bring me hand-drawn cards and whisper secrets into my neck when he was 5. He just nodded again. "I see," I said, swallowing the weight rising in my throat. "They didn't want to help me grieve. They wanted me gone. Out of the house. Out of the way." No one said it outright, but the message was clear. It wasn't a discussion. It was an eviction wrapped in politeness. I sat there, barely tasting my food, and realized something I never expected to feel so late in life. I was no longer seen as part of the family. I was seen as excess. And somehow, in the span of one dinner, I'd gone from wife and mother to guest. A guest who had overstayed her welcome. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it hum the same rhythm Frank used to match with his breathing, but he wasn't there to match it anymore. I kept hearing Trina's voice, smooth, firm, final. The next morning she came by again, this time with a brochure in her hand. "It's called Rose Garden Senior Living," she said, placing it gently on the kitchen counter like a peace offering. "Private units, shuttle service, social activities. It would be great for someone your age." I didn't touch it. She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "You could meet new people, Eleanor. Keep busy. Brian and I think it would be good for you." I looked at her. "This is my home." She tilted her head. "It was Frank's home. You know that, right?" Before I could answer, Brian walked in and said, "We've been talking about converting your bedroom into a nursery. Trina and I are thinking of trying for another baby." I turned to him. "This is where you grew up. This is where we celebrated your birthdays, your graduations, your wedding." "I know," he said, looking everywhere but at me. "But it makes sense now. You'd be more comfortable somewhere smaller, somewhere quieter." What he meant was, I'd be more comfortable somewhere far away. Trina chimed in, "You could take 2 weeks. Pack slowly. We'll help with the moving truck." I stared at them, realizing that this wasn't a suggestion. It was a schedule. 2 weeks to erase 32 years of memories. 2 weeks to make space for their new life. I'd scrubbed this kitchen floor after Brian spilled spaghetti sauce during his 5th birthday party. I'd burned my hand on this stove cooking Frank's favorite roast. I'd lived here. And now they were talking about me like I was clutter. Something to be boxed up and moved out. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just nodded slowly, walked back upstairs, and sat on the edge of my bed. If they were planning to take everything from me, they clearly didn't understand what Frank had really left behind. The following morning I put on the dark gray blazer Frank always said made me look sharp and unstoppable. I didn't feel unstoppable, but I needed answers. I drove to First Federal Bank 15 minutes away, past the bakery where Frank used to get our Sunday muffins. We'd gone to this bank together for years, but I'd always stayed in the car while he handled the paperwork. This time I walked in alone. Brenda Wallace, the bank manager, greeted me with kind eyes and a voice dipped in sympathy. "Mrs. Miller, I was so sorry to hear about Frank. He always had a story to share about his grandkids." "Thank you, Brenda. I need your help. I don't know much about our accounts. Frank handled all of it." She led me to her office, typing quickly as she pulled up our profiles. Then, she paused. Her eyebrows rose, and she leaned slightly closer to the screen. "Oh my." My stomach turned. "Is something wrong?" Not wrong, she said slowly, just unexpected. There are more accounts than I thought. She printed a few pages. Let's start with your joint checking account. It had enough to cover a few months of living expenses. Modest, predictable. Then came the savings account. Much larger, enough to live comfortably for years. I took a breath. But Brenda wasn't done. There are several other accounts in your name only, she said, flipping through files. 2 CDs, a money market account, and a trust account. My name? I asked, confused. That can't be right. Frank never told me about any of this. He probably did what a lot of husbands do, Brenda said gently. Brought you in to sign documents without explaining the details. It's common and legal. She showed me forms with my signature. I recognized my own handwriting. Some dated years back, one on the day we changed our home address, another on a visit I'd barely remembered. Everything was properly set up, every dollar legally mine. But then came the twist I hadn't expected. The trust account had been receiving steady deposits not from our savings but from a business account. Frank's old company. I blinked. But he sold the business when he retired. Brenda glanced at her monitor. The account is still active. Someone's been managing it. Mrs. Miller, I think it's time you speak with the business accountant. As I left the bank, a file of printouts in my hand, I felt the first flicker of something new. Not fear. Not grief. Power. The next morning, I arrived at a modest office complex nestled between a dry cleaner and a dentist. The brass plaque read, Jennings Company, Business Accounting Services. Inside, the receptionist led me to a small but tidy office where Harold Jennings stood to greet me. Late 60s, gentle posture, pressed shirt, eyes that had seen enough numbers and family dramas to stay neutral. Mrs. Miller, he said, shaking my hand. I worked with Frank for almost 2 decades. He was a very intentional man. I'm starting to realize that, I said quietly. We sat. I opened my file of bank documents. I was told by the bank that the construction business account is still active. That money's been transferring into a trust in my name. Harold adjusted his glasses. Yes, that's correct. Frank restructured the company about 5 years ago. Instead of selling, he transferred its assets into the Miller Construction Trust. You're listed as the sole beneficiary. I stared at him. I own the company. The trust owns it. You own the trust, he explained. Frank was deliberate. He didn't want the business entangled in probate or family disputes. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. He continued. Your husband maintained oversight, but day-to-day operations have been managed by Tom Benson, your foreman. Very capable, loyal. Harold printed several pages and passed them across the desk. These are the last 5 years of profit and loss. The company's doing well. Frank focused on steady, smaller contracts, reliable income, minimal risk. I looked at the numbers. It was more money than I'd seen in one place. Then Harold pulled another file from his drawer. Frank also kept detailed loan records. Your son, Brian, has received nearly $90,000 over the past 5 years. All documented. I swallowed hard. Loan records? Yes, every payment signed. But Brian hasn't repaid most of them. He's in significant arrears. It was like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Every time Brian and Trina said they were struggling, Frank had helped them but protected me just as fiercely. Harold hesitated. There's something else. A month ago, Brian contacted me. He assumed your husband's death meant he would be taking over the business. He asked for a transfer of authority. I blinked. Did you give it to him? No. I told him only the trust's beneficiary could authorize that. He seemed surprised that it was you. I nodded slowly, the picture becoming clearer. Brian and Trina weren't just trying to take my home. They were circling a business they thought was theirs. But Frank had been 5 steps ahead. And now? I was ready to take the next one. The next afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, holding a cup of black coffee in both hands. The same table where Brian once built Lego castles and spilled orange juice on spelling tests. Now, it was the setting for something else entirely. Tom Benson, the foreman Frank had trusted for over 2 decades, sat across from me. His hands were rough, fingers stained from years of real work. He looked uncomfortable but alert. Mrs. Miller, I'll be honest, he said, voice low. Brian showed up at the job site last week, talking like he was in charge. Asked for access to our client contracts, equipment keys, even the payroll files. What did you tell him? I told him that without written instruction from the trust beneficiary, I couldn't do a thing. Mr. Frank always told me, no paper, no power. I nodded. He never said it would be Brian, did he? No, ma'am, Tom said. He always said you'd know what to do when the time came. Before I could respond, the front door opened without a knock. Brian walked in, business casual, holding a notepad like it made him important. Trina followed close behind, her heels striking the hardwood like punctuation marks. They both stopped short when they saw Tom. I didn't realize we had company, Brian said. Tom came to check on me, I said calmly. He's always been thoughtful. Brian nodded curtly, then turned his attention to Tom. Good. You're here. I need an updated inventory of company equipment and contracts. Also, access to the accounts. Tom stayed silent. Tom? Brian pressed. You can coordinate with me directly from now on? Tom's eyes met mine. I gave him the smallest nod. Who should I get authorization from? Tom asked, voice even. Me, obviously. I'm Frank's son. Tom tilted his head. Do you have documentation for that authority? The kitchen went still. Brian's confidence cracked. His mouth opened, then closed. Mom, he said, turning to me, can you please explain to Tom that I'm handling Dad's affairs? I set my coffee down and folded my hands. No, Brian, you're not. Tom is right to ask for proper documentation, and until you have it, he takes direction from me. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was seismic. For the first time in years, I wasn't being talked over. I was being heard. 3 days later, at exactly 7 a.m., my phone rang. Brian. Mom, we need to talk. Now, Trina and I are coming over. The line went dead before I could respond. I dressed deliberately. Navy blue dress, silver necklace Frank gave me on our 25th anniversary. If there was going to be a fight, I was going to look like I belonged in the ring. They arrived 20 minutes later. Trina didn't wait for the doorbell. She pushed inside like she owned the place, clutching her designer purse like a shield. Brian followed, tense and tight-lipped. What's going on? He demanded. Tom says he won't give me access to anything without your authorization. I motioned to the living room. Sit, if you'd like. I have something to show you. They didn't sit. Instead, they stood like two attorneys ready to press a case. Brian is your son, Trina snapped. He's entitled to manage Frank's affairs. The business. The house. All of it. I understand that's what you believed, I said softly. I opened the folder I'd placed carefully on the coffee table. Inside were the trust documents, financial statements, and copies of the loan agreements. I slid them across the table. Henderson Construction has been owned by a trust for 5 years. I am the sole beneficiary. It is not part of Frank's estate. You have no claim to it. Brian's face paled. Trina grabbed the documents and skimmed them with shaking hands. This can't be right, she whispered. You don't even know how to run a business. I don't have to, I replied. Tom does, and the numbers speak for themselves. Brian looked like someone who'd just been handed a new language and told to recite it from memory. But the house, he said, latching onto the one thing he thought he had. It's still part of the estate. It's worth over $400,000. Yes, I nodded. Which is why Frank took out a home equity loan for $350,018 months ago. He moved the funds into the construction trust. Trina blinked. That's not possible. We would have known. You weren't co-owners, I said gently. Frank was. He didn't need your signature. The room went quiet. Their empire of assumptions was beginning to collapse. And I was still standing on ground they'd never owned in the first place. It had been 3 weeks since that confrontation, and I had to admit, things hadn't turned out the way Brian and Trina had hoped. They had fought me on every front, called me greedy, controlling, even accused me of ruining the family, but none of their tactics worked. The truth was, they hadn't done their homework. Brian finally called me one afternoon. His voice was strained, but this time it wasn't an accusation. Mom, we need to talk. I agreed to meet at my lawyer's office. When I walked in, Brian was already there, sitting at the conference table, his face drawn. Trina wasn't with him. The silence between us was thick, the kind that can only come from too many unsaid words. I've been thinking about what you said, Brian started, his gaze fixed on the desk. I was angry, but I think I was more angry at myself. I should have done more for you. For us. I sat down, not knowing what to say. This was the son I raised, the one who would stand by me through anything. But he was also the one who had sided with Trina without question, who had let her manipulate him for years. You're right, I said softly, but it's never too late to make things right. We both sat there for a long time, the clock ticking away the seconds. Finally, Brian looked up, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years: guilt. Yes, but also hope. Mom, I want to fix this. I want to make things right between us. I know I can't undo the past, but can we start over? For the sake of the family? I nodded, feeling the weight of it all lift off my shoulders. I think that's a good idea. We reached an agreement that day, a new understanding. The business would remain in the trust, and Brian would take an active role in its management, but it would be under my oversight. The house would stay with me, as Frank had intended, and for the first time in years I felt like I was in control. It wasn't the easy way, but it was the right way. Brian walked out of that office a changed man, unburdened, humbled, and finally ready to see things through my eyes. As for me, I had reclaimed my life, my legacy, and most importantly, my peace. I didn't need their approval. All I needed was to know that the woman I had become was enough. The journey had been long, full of twists and turns that tested my strength and my resolve. At the end of it all, though, I was no longer the woman who had been blindsided by betrayal. I had grown into someone who understood her worth, her rights, and the importance of protecting both. I had taken control of my life, reclaimed my dignity, and built a future that was mine to shape. Not all battles are won by force. Sometimes the quietest victories speak the loudest. As I sit here now, watching the sun dip below the horizon from my little cottage by the coast, I realize that the best revenge is not in taking what others think belongs to you, but in refusing to let them take what's already yours. And if that means walking away, letting go of the past, and the people who tried to hold you back, then that's exactly what I'll do. This is my story. But more than that, it's a lesson for anyone who feels small, powerless, or unseen. You have more strength than you know, and sometimes the best way to heal is to finally stand up for yourself.